Hey everybody, it is Tuesday, and like I promised, I'm going to have more data for you. Now, I can't show you some of the text because I got an advance copy of a paper that's going to be published, and there's markups all over it and like potential personal information in places. So I'm not obviously going to show that stuff, but I am going to go through it so you have an idea of what's happening in science and I uh, why I feel confident that this age of I'll say postulation in regarding video games, and in this case sexism, we've still got a, bless you Momo, we've still got a hangover for the video games cause violence thing, but they are interlinked as what I'm going to talk about shows. If you like this kind of stuff, because I don't know how to make a catchy heading on this that people are going to watch on YouTube, that YouTube's algorithm likes, and also doesn't get demonetized. So if you like this kind of stuff, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K. You also get background goodies about Boss Fight and what's coming up with Boss Fight, because work has begun in earnest. You see a glue gun in the background there. But some of you who follow my content may know the work of Professor Chris Ferguson. And for those of you who don't, Christopher Ferguson is in the Department of Psychology at Stetson University. He advises on a lot of stuff, but specific to this is he does a lot of research into video games and correlation / potential causations regarding video games and violence, video games and sexism. He tries to get the good stuff to refute the bad stuff, essentially. And so he put up on Twitter saying, anybody want an advanced copy of my new study that he has collaborated on with, John Colwell, a gent from the University of Westminster, in this upcoming paper where they attempt to test using an albeit small-ish sample size, theories about whether sexist content causes sexist opinions about women or whatever. And if you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm trying to get the Zoom to work. There we go. And the paper's very interesting. And even though it's a small sample, the reason I'm hopeful, the reason I think that papers like this are the beginning of the end to this nonsense that video games somehow make you sexist, is because the methodology in papers like this is much better than the methodology in previous papers. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the researchers didn't know what they're doing in the past. It's just this is the way science works. Early people make some mistakes that, while well-meaning, mean that the process has to be refined and refined and refined. And one of the things this paper does is break down the stuff that's come before and broken down the competing theories of what happens regarding sexist attitudes and sexualized content. Now, one of the things I like about this paper that I've been forwarded is that they specify in the preamble, the background, that it's very hard to determine what a sexist game is. And the reason I went ding, ding, ding is if you've seen Lady Bits, that was one of the things that I encountered as well. The idea that, what's a sexist game mean? Like, because there's, first of all, so little depictions of women in gaming. I mean, one could say that is somewhat sexist, a lack of representation at all. Okay, that's something that we might be able to say, yes, there's no women in this game, and in some cases, historical military or whatever, it's hard to sort of shoehorn female characters in there. But others, fantasy settings and things like that, one could argue that an artificial lack of representation, a lack of, percentages of men and women that aren't in line with the, 50-50 split or 51-49% split in the general population, some could say, well, that is sexist. That is not accurate. But other stuff, like usually the things that are claimed to be sexist are basically sexualized depictions of women. And that's where the difficulty comes, because the dictionary definition of sexism, as you saw in Lady Bits, is of no help. And so I actually had to define for Lady Bits, and I do this in my college lectures as well, a functional, testable definition of sexism, which is basically sexism is any attitude or behavior that creates or perpetuates dominance of one gender over other genders. That is the definition I came up with, because, discrimination on the basis of sex doesn't do much. What does that mean? That's a circular definition, right? And so that's what I came up with for Lady Bits. I found it's worked fairly well. But it was cool to see academia struggling with the same problem. They also deal with the some will say two, some will say three opposing theories about the relationship between media and antisocial behaviors. One, which I dealt with in Lady Bits and pretty much shown why it doesn't really work, was cultivation theory. Cultivation theory is as the paper says, and other online sources, sorry, I'm gesturing to a screen you can't see, other online sources acknowledge as sort of the dominant right now theory. There are a lot of problems with that dominant theory, that consuming media cultivates attitudes it was developed for television. It doesn't really work well with video games. In media in general, cultivation theory is complex. And that's what sort of gave rise to the idea that it's not that media creates sexism or violent attitudes or other sorts of things in someone not predisposed to it. People who like sexism and violence will seek out and enjoy sexist and violent entertainment. That's apparently called the catalyst model. I had never heard that term before this. I guess it's a term in psychiatry, which is what this paper is grounded in. And that's really important because obviously, and I've talked about this a lot, I took anthropology in university, so I come at it in a particular way. A sociologist comes at it in a totally different way that makes no sense to me. And a psychology professor is going to come at it in a way that's actually pretty close, it turns out, to the way I approach things, which I found very interesting. But then there's a third model, apparently, just for full disclosure in what my research outside this paper found. It's called the downward spiral model, or a negative feedback loop, meaning that people who already have sexist or violent attitudes, they consume sexist or violent media, and this basically makes things worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Now, of course, all of these models have limitations, because what influences a person's behavior, and the paper points this out, what influences a person's behavior is a stew of factors, including, early childhood development, senses of self, early childhood nurturing, genetics, which becomes really iffy because people use that genetic component to go a lot of really unscientific places, trying to trying to define entire races or entire genders by some genetic component, which just isn't borne out by research. But what I liked about this paper is it factored in all of these limitations. It was very, very careful to say, yes, our sample size is pretty small. They found that they needed 152 people to get a margin of error they were happy with. They didn't quite get that. They got 180 recipients, but didn't participants, but people didn't complete the survey, because the survey sounded quite lengthy. Like, they got people to list their top 3 games and how often they played it, and they got them to fill out surveys in advance about various tendencies, how high they rate in aggression, how high they rate in sexism, things like that, before doing the main questionnaire. And like, it sounded like a lot of fill out, so I'm not surprised that people just didn't go, what, this isn't a BuzzFeed survey, and ditched it. But it's a start. And the nice thing about these small papers is it gives people opportunities to do big papers. And what I like about reading papers like this, unlike some papers that pound the table metaphorically more often, more overtly, is that they recognize these limitations. And that's very important, because if an academic paper doesn't recognize limitations in methodology, I question the paper, because there's especially in something as messy, and I don't say that as a pejorative, it's just a descriptor, as psychology. There are going to be limitations to every model. I mean, even certain diagnoses, there's no test that you get a positive or negative whether somebody has, say, bipolar disorder. It's a series of symptoms. We think it's this, therefore we're going to treat for this, and if it works, awesome. And that's the thing when you're dealing with people. People are individuals. People are not toasters. People are not carbon copies of each other. A marker of objectification is fungibility for a reason. People are not interchangeable. And so when we get into this thing of what do games do to you, I'm a shining example of somebody who has been playing violent video games. Okay, I started on the Atari and arcades, but still, they were shooty games on the Atari. And I've talked in the past about how, Resident Evil blew my mind. By today's standards, I was way too young to play Resident Evil. I was about 15 years old when Resident Evil came out. That would have made me like 12 or 13, I think, when the original Mortal Kombat came out. Played Street Fighter. If there was any cultivated effect for violent video games or sexist video games, you'd think I would be a prime target for that. Grew up in a not great neighborhood in terms of crime and poverty. Single parent family, not a ton of, other than the color of my skin, privilege going on. But those violent video games, those so-called sexist video games, video games are women where, they're showing thigh. Oh God. Should have turned me into a pervert monster, right? And they didn't. And this is why I am so at odds with conventional wisdom on this subject, because I am not egotistical enough to think I'm just better. I don't believe I'm just stronger or better than anybody else. Something's not right here. Because if this stuff worked the way it was supposed to work, I'd be, like I said, a pervert monster. And this paper begins, it's a step, and any single study is that, just a step. a step to explain why. Because what this paper found is that there's really no correlation between sexist attitudes and sexist video and allegedly sexist video games, sexualized video games. And they specifically tested empathy towards victims of sexual assault. They found the correlational relationship or correlational evidence of a relationship is, as they say, minimal. I looked at it and went, this would not persuade me. They were so careful to check even results that sort of would have sounded like video games had a beneficial effect. It's a very, very neutrally worded study because they found a slight decrease in bad stuff among people who went into the whole thing scoring high in aggression. And I wasn't quite sure based on the wording whether that was from a previous study or theirs, but they didn't find that what they call negative correlation, that it actually went down instead of went up, sufficient enough to claim correlation. And that's good science too. Like, you have to have an effect that is significant enough to put your name on it, right, as an academic. And I actually think that that's the best possible outcome here. No effect whatsoever. It's not a benefit. It's not harmful. No effect whatsoever. Because if there is an effect one way or the other, as we saw, the reason I'm saying I'm not sure if I read it properly that they found that in this study is because there have been previous studies where they actually showed some beneficial effects to playing video games. So the more I think about it and reading the study, it's like, yeah, I realize that no effect whatsoever is actually the best possible outcome in terms of some sort of friggin' consistency in media theory. Like, I shouldn't be pulling for an outcome. This is why I'm not a researcher. Because I do have an investment in this, just because, and this is stating my bias, if there's any link at all, I'm kind of wrong. And that's important to admit. But what I found interesting was that the fact that they're actually able, and they were very careful about providing caveats to the tools they use to test for aggression. But I did find it interesting that they were taking sort of the games cause violence and tying it into the games cause sexism through, what is sort of an intersection point for all of that. And the thing that I think causes the most concern with this stuff is, sexually predatory behaviors. I think we would all like that sort of thing to stop. And, the fact that they can't find any link, and this is far from the first study I've seen that says this. The fact that multiple studies now show no link means that, and they actually say this in the paper, people who are going to advocate for increased inclusion in games can't do it based on the harm principle. Meaning, these things are harmful, so you have to stop. You have to make a compelling business case or artistic case for anybody to do anything different. What does that mean in plainer words? Meaning, since we can't prove harm of these products, show us how changes will make us more money. And that's really at the core, historically, of a lack of female representation in video games. It's that, and this would be, Professor Ferguson, if you're watching this video, this would be a very, very useful study to see if, because stuff in the past and anecdotally, there's been no evidence that I've seen that adult males are less inclined to play games with female playable characters than with male playable characters. That's an issue among middle school boys. It starts to wane in high school, and by adulthood, people don't care. If men didn't want to play as women, Tomb Raider would have been a dud, right? It wasn't. It was the killer app for the original PlayStation. So that would be interesting as well, because that would actually be able to make a business case for you lose nothing by putting more women in active roles in your game. But you also gain something, because what I've found in the research I've done is that who gender of the playable character is super important for? Women, as opposed to men. So if men don't care and women want to play as women, and that's a sweeping generalization, obviously, but women are more likely to find it a plus to play as a female character, why wouldn't you make female playable characters? Now, a female playable character is not going to make sense in every artistic circumstance. And that's the other thing. I mean, let's face it, this is only an issue in the West. Nobody in Japan is going to go, oh no, people won't consume media, men won't consume media with female leads in them, considering like their top 4, the top 10 highest grossing films of all time, like 7 or 8 of them, last I checked, have female leads. Movies like Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle and Frozen, Titanic, Avatar, I think, is up there too. All, female co-leads or female leads. And that's what's so messed up about this whole debate. The reason we are fighting about this stuff at all is when video games were this little niche hobby that people were playing on like home computers, which were fairly rare at the time. Nobody thought, oh, we have to maximize our profits on this. And that's why we had more women making games as percentage of the whole thing, and more female protagonists. I mean, you look back in the day and you see like The Perils of Rosella, King's Quest game, had a female protagonist, and the frickin' sky didn't fall. And then, Lara Croft, the Tomb Raider games were such a huge phenomenon that they burned that franchise out. But then something happened around sort of the Xbox era. This idea that I guess some marketing company did a focus group. And if you're at all a creator, focus group makes your stomach hurt because they're notoriously frustrating. But somebody somewhere did a focus group that told them games with female leads don't sell. And what we started getting was this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where they didn't put as much marketing into the games with female leads, and so they're, less spectacular results in the games that they went whole hog on the marketing on. And obviously certain games like, Mass Effect and Assassin's Creed Odyssey and things like that, they give you a choice, which I think, again, is ideal. If you want to play as a man, fine. If you want to play as a female, fine. Indie games can't do that because of budgets sometimes, but the truth is that indie games don't have to sell a bazillion copies like I was talking about yesterday. But I think papers like this are extremely important because, and I don't think they'll get the same headlines as the negative doom and gloom because they don't fit the convenient narrative that certain parents groups and politicians and Joe Biden, I know he's a politician, that was just a joke, but unfortunately, we've got people on both sides of the U.S. divide right now. And I mean, even the Prime Minister of Canada was guilty of it early on in his tenure as Prime Minister. He's since shut up about it, I think, maybe because people like me went to town halls and were very firm with the member of parliament I spoke to is now cabinet minister. So I'm sure that I wasn't the only one going, that's not true about a link between video games and sexism. But well-meaning lawmakers, well-meaning regulators, well-meaning advocates need reasonably reliable data to combat this moral panic that it always happens, right? That gets out because people like, it must be true through this, bad reasoning. And it takes us 3 to 5 years to get sufficient data that, only the most unwilling to listen of people, can tune it out. Most people, if you show them compelling evidence, they'll be like, all right, I can understand the fear of parents that they don't want to accidentally turn their kid into an axe murderer, right? The issue with giving violent games to children is not that it will make them violent. It's that it will make them scared. It is, and this makes sense, right? That if a kid is not at an age where they're into that stuff, the gore will freak them out. Some kids are more sensitive than others. Some kids have more empathy than others. And so you got to know your kid. One of the things the study did is checked for empathy as well, which I thought was great. Like, they measured aggression, they measured empathy, like all the stuff that I wanted to see in past studies that wasn't there. And you guys have seen things on this channel where I'm like, you can't catch all this stuff. You can't lump 14-year-olds in with 25-year-olds. They're not at the same developmental stage and this, that, the next thing. And I want to close there because there's another major issue with the way video games are being handled, and I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow, is that, like I said, I grew up in not the greatest neighborhood. I love it. I think one of the best things that happened to me in my life is where I grew up. It made me a better person. But it had issues related to poverty and crime and racial inequality and injustice and all that stuff. But what we learned is that if you crap on the stuff that kids like, they don't listen to you. They don't let you in. You cannot be of influence to them if you're seeming horrified by the stuff they like. And when I was coming up, it was not just video games. It was hip hop and grunge, or as people called it back then, rap music. And I want to talk about that tomorrow because I'm out of time today. But I want to talk about the actual harm of claiming video games are harmful. And but I had to do, of course, first of all, make a compelling argument that they're actually not harmful. Because if something's harmful, like don't drink lead, it's not harmful to say that because, don't drink bleach. That'll kill you, right? At this point, I'm just willing to say that if there was some reasonable correlation, studies would have been able to replicate it. We're just getting at the point where how long are we going to have to study this before there's nothing there? There's no correlation. It's all just about tastes and interests. Now, there are issues, but again, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. Okay, so if you like this sort of content, because again, probably won't do much on YouTube, but help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K, and great many thanks to Professor Christopher J. Ferguson and John Colwell. I hope I'm pronouncing Colwell correctly with my Canadiana accent. All right, thanks for watching.